If anybody could stun me into red-faced silence, it was going to be Anne Marie. And you know that we're work sisters because we are dressed practically identically tonight. It's such a pleasure to be with you tonight, really, to see so many friends and so many extraordinarily talented people. All of you here striving to enrich the profession that we love. It's a particular joy to see Jason and Yegi, each dipping into the riches of Harvard through Nieman and Shorenstein fellowships as they prepare for the next chapter of their life together. It's important to call out their ordeal in Tehran tonight as we honor Joe Alex Morris Jr., who died there 37 years ago, covering the revolution that changed Iran then and to this day. I was really glad to hear more about him, and I was doing research for this and found one of the stories about his death in which a colleague noted that he died as he lived, running to cover another Mideast conflict. I was really struck by that phrase, running to cover another Mideast conflict. Because it's a phrase that says a lot about how international news coverage has changed and how it hasn't in the decades since we lost Joe. Today, alas, the words Mideast conflict are so trite that they've become a corrosive shorthand for, good Lord, those people are at it again. What a mess of a place. I can't stand to think about it. Turn the page and see what else there is. Iran and Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Libya, remember Libya? Bahrain, Yemen, Israel, Gaza. It's too easy to think of these as places where only fighting happens. Fighting over religion, over power, over land, the three great roots of almost every conflict on the planet. But the journalists who cover these countries know better. That they know that these are rich and vibrant nations filled with people who have much in common with every other human around the world. They want ordinary things, a home, meaningful work that will allow them to put food on the table and allow them to care for their children. They want a quiet and peaceful life, a mundane life. And yet, who will read a story about a quiet and peaceful life? Instead, we seem to think audiences are more interested in the quest for that life, the hope for that life, rather than the living of one. And that is just one of the many thorny issues we face when we try to cover the world. Today, we are in the middle of another epic shift on the planet. Millions of people are on the move, fleeing years-long conflicts and destruction, or just seeking that better life for their families. What is the human response to that tide of humanity? Fear, barriers, slammed doors, and rightward shifts in governments. Across the Western world now, there is much talk about the other, potential economic parasites out to take something from those who are already safe and comfortable. If you read history, and I hope some of you are reading it here at Harvard, you know we've been here many times before. Indeed, most of us in this room have family stories about grandparents who fled a pogrom, or great-great-aunts who escaped a potato famine, our ancestors who crossed borders to find work and found a new home instead. Before they found home, they almost certainly faced what today's migrants face: rejection and prejudice, bigotry and mistreatment. Perhaps, after a time, some slow changes, grudging acceptance, eventually, perhaps even genuine acceptance and respect. And in each of your family stories and mine, each of those sagas is a story, a good human story that our audiences should crave, and maybe will crave. So what's the lesson for journalism in this? That big seismic events are hard for us to see, hard to grasp, overwhelming. We need the intimacy of the individual stories to help us make sense of it all. We can't absorb that 3,000 people or more have died trying to reach Europe in flimsy rubber boats that give way. That's a number. It isn't people. But we can understand the agony of Huda Malek, pregnant with her first child, in one of those flimsy overloaded dinghies, slowly sinking a mile from the Greek sanctuary of Lesbos. We can imagine what it's like for her when all the goods on board of the boat have been thrown over, trying to keep the boat afloat, to no avail. And the horror when her husband, Tariq Sheikh, stands up and says, "I'm doing this to save you, our child, and everyone on board," and then he jumps overboard. Malik's boat makes it to shore, and a desperate rescue effort finally returns Tariq to her, shuddering and soaked, but alive. That's one of the stories that Patrick McDonald of the LA Times told about the millions of people moving from countries in conflict, seeking countries in peace. The Times stayed in touch, and we learned months later that Malik and Tariq have settled in the central French city of Lyon. Are we now invested in them and in their story? How will they blend their old life and the new? Will their baby speak French as a first language? Will they bring the heat of ground Aleppo peppers to the buttery creaminess of potatoes lyonnaises? How will Lyon change their family story? And how will they change Lyon? Will all the Maliks and Tariqs further change the face, the taste, the clothes, and the colors of Europe? Or will the fear of the Maliks and Tariqs break Europe into a jigsaw puzzle of authoritarian nations who prefer their isolation, their razor wire fences, and their punishing policies? These are really big questions, and as a profession, we have to try to answer them. But can we? Journalism, the saying goes, is the first rough draft of history. Well, what if history is just too big for journalism? If we can't figure this out, are we damning ourselves to endlessly repeat history because we've not learned anything from it? I hope not, but I'm worried. I'm worried that the world moves so quickly now that stories don't stick. We consume news, we react by clicking like or emoticon sad face, and then we move on. And we forget. And when society moves on so quickly, there isn't enough time to motivate action by the institutions that could change things on the ground. Remember, bring back our girls? Nearly 1,000 days later, most of the Nigerian schoolgirls are still gone. And the ones that have come back have been shunned by their families and neighbors for having been kidnapped by Boko Haram in the first place. Did the social media campaign help the girls? I don't know. Did coverage of the social Bring Back Our Girls campaign help the girls? I don't know that either. What I do know is most everyone has already forgotten them. And that's the shame and the crime of it all. It's images of children that often capture our imaginations. Just 15 months ago, the world was heartbroken by pictures of a tiny boy's body, clad in a red shirt and tiny little shoes, washed up on the Turkish beach. Alan Kurdi drowned with his mother and older brother as his family journeyed from Syria, full of hope for a better life. Around the world, people reacted with horror and sadness. And we as a profession do what we always do. We did a story about their reaction, and a story about media coverage of their reaction. And it lasted for a little while. Almost nothing changed. And we moved on, reacting to the next photo of a child shocked and bloody by war. Now contrast that with Nick Ut's 1969 picture of Kim Phuc, naked and badly burned by napalm, running down the road, her face a scream of agony. That picture was one of several that helped change American views about the war in Vietnam. And it endures to this day. It's a little grainy, black and white, but it still endures. So why does the image of Kim Phuc stay with us and the image of Alan Kurdi slip away? Maybe in part because there weren't so many pictures to look at in 1969. There weren't so many stories competing for our attention. Maybe because the picture of Kim was printed on paper, held in our hands, and frozen. The picture of Alan was printed too, but as a digital image, It was shared and touched and copied and turned into memes and cartoons. It was changed. I fear that the Allens and the Maliks and the Tariks and the missing Nigerian schoolgirls just get lost in all the noise that we invite into our lives. So in this avalanche of journalism and images, in this cacophony of arguments about how the world should really be, where is the place for journalism? What is our role? There's no magic answer here. Our mission is always going to be to inform the world. And I believe in that mission now more than ever. But how we go about that demands more of us, both as individual journalists, and it especially demands more of the institutions that employ journalists, even though they are challenged economically like never before. What does that mean? It is not enough to simply report on what happened. Now, I've heard that in every newsroom I've been in for 150 years. But it's really true. You can't just talk about what happened. You can't just go cover bang bang and war and elections and consider your job done. News consumers want to know why something happened and what it means. And I don't just mean adding a couple of paragraphs of context that are actually quotes from some expert, possibly one from Harvard.
Possibly, probably.
No, we really must offer genuine insight, the kind that comes from experience with a subject or a place, the kind that Alyssa Rubin and Kathy Gannon can bring to stories from Afghanistan because they've lived and worked there for years. Investigations have a place as well. We must continue to investigate the institutions of power outside the United States just as we do inside the United States. We need the kind of work that David Barboza has done in China, that several news organizations have done exposing mistreatment of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, and the kind of work that, yes, 4 women, I'm sorry, I'm going to pause here because I'm really proud of this, 4 women from the Associated Press did in exposing slavery in the seafood industry. And we must continue to find the intimacy that will help audiences get their heads around big stories. And I don't mean just an anecdotal lead, but storytelling that puts the audiences right next to you and then opens up to expose a well-founded bigger thought. That's not a new idea either. In 1943, in the height of World War II, George Weller of the Chicago Daily News was writing not of the sweeping battles that encircled the globe, but about a pharmacist's mate on board a U.S. Navy submarine deep below enemy waters who saved another sailor's life by performing an emergency appendectomy. And just in that little short description, we can all go down into that claustrophobic sub and imagine what life was like for that pharmacist mate. Weller's story won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that year, one of the most dynamic years in international news. I know. Insight and intimacy and investigation all take patience and resources that are hard to come by in many news organizations. But we can make better choices. Slow, deep news over more drive-by bang-bang. And that means news organizations, old and new, must stop creating the market for frenzied freelancers who are struggling to make a living by pinging from conflict to conflict. You can pay them to do fewer but smarter, deeper stories. And by God, you better be paying them and not calling up stories on spec. And you better make sure that you're asking them, that if you are asking them to do something in a difficult place, that you're doing so under the guidelines for freelancers that have been put in place by organizations like the International Press Institute and the Committee to Protect Journalists, who've worked so hard to keep freelancers safe because we as a profession couldn't manage it on our own. It's dangerous out there. So slow down and do the right thing by your people in the field. And for heaven's sake, stop assigning stories that feed the cycle of tragedy porn, the ones that solicit a burst of information of emotion that soon fades. You're numbing your audiences, not enlightening them. More than a decade ago, we began to refer to this as the Baghdad bus bomb problem. Iraq was riven by sectarian fighting, and people were dying by the scores nearly every day. The stories were very hard to report. It was dangerous, and it took a lot of time to get them right, and almost nobody cared. Anthony Shadid wrote about this in 2010 in a story that reflects his insight into a country he had covered for nearly a decade at that point. I'm going to read just a little. Dateline, Abu Ghraib, Iraq. At noon on Tuesday, there was an explosion. Gunfire followed, and 33 people were dead, pieces of their corpses mixing with stagnant water, trash, and soggy scraps of food. At noon on Wednesday, there were the Atlau. The word in Arabic means the remains or the ruins, the traces of something left behind. And he goes on to say, in 2003, when America began its occupation, bombings with half the casualties of Tuesdays suggested that the United States might not prevail. But today, when America and its Iraqi allies seemed to be winning, the attack failed to make the front page of even the government newspaper in Iraq. A quote from one of the relatives gave the story its headline, "No one values the victims anymore." Anthony spoke the language of Iraq. He traced his family heritage back from Oklahoma to Lebanon and had the gift of infusing his work with insight and intimacy. You need that language and that understanding of a place to cover it well. A fixer cannot give you insight or intimacy. You need people who are covering their own countries and people who see it with a stranger's eyes. The combination of those two views is very powerful indeed. This work is increasingly dangerous, more dangerous than it has ever been in my entire 43-year career, a number which I find horrifying, I'd just say. It's dangerous for expats, but it's especially dangerous for local journalists who are covering their home territories. Last year was the deadliest on record for journalists, and this year journalists are being jailed on trumped-up charges in record numbers as well. Autocratic leaders demand fawning coverage, and if they don't get it, the price is prison. It's not a very pretty picture, is it? The work is dangerous, the risks are high, the market is shrinking, and the audience is subject to boredom and ennui. So, then is international coverage worth it? Of course it is. Don't be crazy. It's now more important than ever. Our lives are far too interconnected to turn our backs on the world, and we know from history that the dangers of the rest of the world turning inward as well. Journalism is what can make the difference. Journalism can help people understand each other, can make sense of the complexities, and help us see the common humanity in all. We need journalism to help our fellow humans resist walling themselves off from each other. We owe it to ourselves to make sure we get this right. And we owe it to our fellow global citizens to get this right too. Because at the end of the day, everyone in the world wants one thing: the security of a quiet, peaceful, and mundane life. Thank you very much.